Welcome Formula One News fans. This is the Formula One News Hour and I'm your host Jonathan Steele. Well, we don't have a race this week as the drivers head all the way across the world with their teams for the next Grand Prix, which is next weekend, coming to you from Singapore. But we do have a good program for you today. But let's start by thanking our sponsors: Thinology, Give Send Go, L American, Cloud Hub, Inform America, and last but not least, Off the Press. Off the Press is a publication of Inform America. So now that we've got that out of the way, I guess you've probably noticed we've got a different backdrop today. One of the reasons for that is I was getting grief using the British flag from a number of folks, and I tried to explain that the reason I had the British flag was because Formula One really originated and is the sport of the British people. They said that doesn't make any difference. You're broadcasting from Austin, Texas. You should have the American flag. So I thought, well, I'll just go completely neutral, and I had, as you can see behind me, a Formula One News backdrop created. So that's what we're gonna use from now on. You'll have that nice Formula One News Hour backdrop behind me, so that you all know that you've come to the right place anyway, even if you didn't recognize the voice. So anyway, this week we're going to have a few news items, and then we're going to, in the history section, we're going to look into the life of Bruce McLaren, a very, very talented driver from New Zealand. And New Zealand has a special place in my heart because the first love of my life was from New Zealand. And as I think I've stated, I didn't come to America to stay in the very beginning. I was actually on my way back to Australia, having lived there for a little while. And I never made it, obviously, because I'm in Austin, Texas, 47 years later. But my first real love was a little lady from Fielding, New Zealand, which is on the South Island. So we're going to talk about Bruce McLaren's life, and then because there's not a race today, we're going to look into McLaren Cars, and you know, they changed a little bit over the time between McLaren dying and then the company being formed again. So there's actually two distinct organizations. There's McLaren Racing, and then there's the McLaren Motor Cars. But we'll go into that in the second part. We're going to talk a little bit now about the news, some newsy things that's gone on this week. So let's take a look and see what we've got. So I guess the first bit of news is that Damon Hill was on ITV yesterday, which is a British broadcasting station, and he does not think that Nicholas Latifi deserves the drive at Williams anymore. And he's saying that because he said that Nicholas just doesn't have the speed. Nicholas Latifi is a Canadian Formula One driver. You kind of see me during the races kind of saying, oh yeah, Latifi's last again, and that's just because he can't find the pace out of his car. And so last week when Nick De Vries jumped in the other Williams car because Alex Albon had appendicitis and had his appendix taken out, and that's another part of the news, by the way. He had some difficulties afterwards and had to be put into ICU for a few hours because he was having trouble breathing. But good to say he's all right now, and he's out and about and back in London. I think last week I said that he'd flown back to London to have that operation, and in fact that was not true. He in fact went to a hospital there in Italy, and they did an emergency appendectomy, which is nothing like it used to be. Like when I was a kid, you went to the hospital for a week. Now you go to the hospital for a few hours and you go home. So, but anyway, back to Damon Hill and Nicholas Latifi. Damon Hill believes that Nick De Vries really proved himself at the Monza Grand Prix last weekend. You know, he hadn't really driven a Formula One car that much, and he gets thrown into it in practice 3 and qualifying, and then he gets it on the grid in position 8. Now, he got there because there was a lot, if you remember last week, there was a lot of cars that took grid penalties because they took power packs, new power packs and stuff like that. So, but anyway, he did for his first Formula One Grand Prix. I forget, I think he's the 67th driver overall to earn points in his very first Grand Prix. So, no small task, but he certainly proved himself, and that will certainly have put the pressure on Nicholas Latifi. And if a guy like Damon Hill is coming out and saying he's got to go, then you can be sure the guys at Williams are listening. And for those of you that don't know, Damon Hill is the son of Graham Hill, who was a Formula One champion, and Damon Hill was I believe the 1996 Formula One champion. So a good pedigree and a good person to be able to make that kind of an analysis. So the second part of the news, Jacques Villeneuve is the person that made this comment, and he is the son of Gilles Villeneuve, who was a teammate of Jackie Stewart back in the 70s. A very, very good racing driver from Canada. Of course, Jacques Villeneuve is also Canadian. But anyway, he came out this week and he said that he just doesn't believe that Danny Ricciardo deserves another seat in Formula One. He said, he's really had two pieces to his career. The first part of his career, he was with Red Bull, and he kind of felt pushed out and away from Red Bull because Red Bull turned around after a couple of years and made Max Verstappen their #1 driver, which was a smart move on their part. And then they took in Pierre Gasly as a backup to Max, and then after Pierre didn't work out so well, who's doing really well now, Pierre Gasly is really doing really well now, driving for Alpine. But then they tried Alex Albon, and then Alex Albon didn't work out, and so Alex actually had a year off, and then they brought in Checo Perez, who's done a really, really good job of filling in that #2 spot. So, I made a prediction a couple of weeks ago that I believe that Danny Ricciardo will take the place of Mick Schumacher at Haas. Now, I've also been reading things where Danny Ricciardo is actually talking to Mercedes, and that he may sit out the 2023 year and then come back in when Lewis Hamilton retires. Then Danny Ricciardo would come in as obviously the backup driver to George Russell. So some kind of movings going on in the background there, but we'll see. The time's going to tell. So two other little bits of news. Aston Martin has started their own driver kind of training camp, and they've announced a driver, their first driver, to take a seat in there, and also Joe Granu has not been assured a place with Alfa Romeo for 2023. Now, I read a report where he said he's not too worried about it, but that's, this late in the season, Joe Granu has really done really well here in his first year in Formula One. If you remember, he's the guy that's been about 5 or 6 races ago. He's the guy that got hit right as they were starting, and the car flipped over onto its top, and he was saved. His life was saved by the halo, that bar right on the front of the car when he skidded along and then slammed up against the barriers. But I find that kind of interesting that Joe Granu has not been assured a drive for 2023. Okay, so let's start with our history section for the week, and as I mentioned earlier, the history is on Bruce McLaren. But before we got going on that, we got to thank our sponsors. We can't forget the money that they put in here and help make this all possible. So we're going to start with from Off the Press. for the U.S. audiences, you're going to figure out who I'm talking about pretty much straight away if you really believed in good news. But about a year and a half ago, Drudge sold the Drudge Report, and Drudge was a very good news reporter, and he ran a very good articles. And there was never any propaganda. There was never any quote unquote, as Donald Trump likes to call it, fake news. But since it was sold, it has started leaning way to the left. And so the folks at Inform America started up the new Drudge Report that they call Off the Press. So a very similar layout to the Drudge Report, very similar articles, and no opinions, no kind of fake news stuff. Just really good in the gutter reporting and getting the facts, which are very important for us to be able to read an outlet or read a publication that deals in the facts. So why don't you try Off the Press? That's offthepress.com, and get your news where you can really trust it. They, like the folks from El American, also El American, if you remember, is one of our sponsors. They also only report on the news. The nice thing about El American, even though this is an Off the Press commercial, the El American folks, they broadcast in English and Spanish. So, well, maybe it was kind of a joint promotion there. But yes, please try offthepress.com and elamerican.com. So, on to the history section and Bruce McLaren. So Bruce McLaren was born on August the 30th, 1937, and he died on June the 2nd, 1970. So he didn't live that much longer than the guy who I think is the greatest Formula One champion of all time, Jim Clark. If you remember from that Jim Clark section, I said a lot of Formula One drivers and other race drivers lost their lives there in the 60s. And 1968 was a really bad year, but still, you know, they continued to lose their lives. Another New Zealand guy that lost his life was Denny Hume, who actually drove for Bruce McLaren. He was about a year, 2 years younger. You know, Bruce kind of had a good beginning to be a Formula One driver, a race car driver, because like the drivers of that era, you know, he drove sports cars, he drove rally cars. He in fact, the first race he was in was his dad had converted an Austin 7. Or actually renovated an Austin 7, and he drove that in a hill climb when he was 14 years old. So unlike Fangio, you know, Bruce McLaren got a really early start in racing. So back to my point, his dad owned a gas station and a car repair facility. So Bruce was in there at a very early age, working alongside his dad, and so developed a love of cars and started understanding what made them tick and how to drive them at a very early age. When Bruce was about 9 years old, he developed Perthes disease. That is a disease where the blood flow to the hip gets changed or gets interrupted a little bit, and the bone. So that's where, you know, you get your growth spurts. When you're growing, there's different growth spurts in your body, and your hip's part of that, and he lost blood flow there. So his left leg was actually a little shorter than his right leg, which is kind of an interesting thing. You never really noticed that about him when you'd see him walking around and stuff. You kind of didn't notice that one of his legs was a little shorter than the other. But anyway, it didn't interrupt his career, didn't interrupt his time in the Formula One car. So he went all the way through school. He was born in Auckland, New Zealand. Very nice city. If you ever get a chance to go there, go there. You're only an hour or so away from the Bay of Islands, and you're another hour or so away from skiing. It's an amazing place, that part of the world. You can go sunbathing and skiing. I mean, sunbathing and swimming in the ocean in the morning, and then in the afternoon you can be up in the mountains and skiing. And the Bay of Islands, by the way, has one of the longest beaches in the world. So yeah, I've been there a couple of times. Really enjoyed my time there. So Bruce was born in Auckland, went to school in Auckland, and actually studied engineering at a university in Auckland. Before he was sent to England by the New Zealand kind of racing club association, Bruce had proved himself so well by the time he was roughly 19. In fact, he came second in the New Zealand came second to Jack Brabham in the New Zealand Grand Prix in 1958. And they were so impressed, they wanted to give him an opportunity to get and race with the really good drivers out of Europe, and so off he went. And actually that was a very opportune time for him, because Jack Brabham, who we're going to deal with in another segment, also a very good racing driver. He was from Australia, but he also built his own race cars. And so although Bruce spent his first 7 years driving for Cooper, James Cooper. You heard of the Mini Cooper? Well, so the Mini Cooper was a joint venture between British Leyland and James Cooper. It was a high performance Mini is what it was. But so he drove for Cooper for the first 7 years of his racing career, even though he had got into later in that 3-4 years later building his own race cars. He continued to drive for Cooper. And in 1959, when he drove his first Formula One cars, he was actually a teammate to Jack Brabham. So Jack Brabham and Cooper both, Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren both drove for Cooper, and it sealed a long friendship and relationship with them, with the Cooper cars and with Jack Brabham. Like I said, after Brabham left and went and built his own cars, then Bruce McLaren would go along and drive for Jack Brabham. So a very, very interesting arrangement, and very interesting and influential part to Bruce McLaren's career. A very interesting thing is that Bruce McLaren in 1962, I believe it was, 62, that would have made him about, let me double check my facts a second. Well, it's a good job I checked my facts. It was actually 1959, and if my brain could do any math quickly, then I would quickly realize that the reason for this segment on Bruce was because he became the youngest Formula One driver of all time at that time. He won the United States Grand Prix, and he was 22 years, 104 days old. And that record stayed intact until 2003, when Alonso became the youngest Formula One driver of all time. So he held that record for a good 40 years, which is quite amazing when you think about it. Now today, the drivers start a lot earlier. So, so Max Verstappen has just turned 24, so he's 23 when he got his first Formula One championship. But to be able to win a Formula One race at such a young age is an amazing thing. But like I say, with the training today, it's a little different. Back then, remember, they were switching from sports cars to rally cars to Formula 2 cars, and then to Formula 1 cars. In fact, back in those days, the Formula 2 and the Formula 1 races were held on the same track at the same time and the same day. In fact, Bruce McLaren's first drive in a Formula 2 car, he was first in Formula 2, but came in 5th overall. Now, think about that. He's in a Formula 2 car, and he came in 5th overall amongst the Formula 1 cars. So one, he had a very, very good car, but two, he knew how to get the most out of those cars and really knew how to drive a Formula One car. So not long after Bruce moved to England from New Zealand, after they moved him over here, then he married his girlfriend Patty, and they were married and stayed married until the day he died, and they had a little baby girl in 1963, I'm thinking. Her name is Amanda, and Amanda today is like a goodwill ambassador for McLaren. So the McLaren name is still associated with McLaren Cars. So later, after Bruce McLaren died, Patty remarried, and in fact she died in 2016. So lived a nice long life. So as Bruce moved through into Formula One, he started really thinking about building his own race cars. And so in 1963, he formed Bruce McLaren Racing, Motor Racing Limited, which is different to the McLaren cars of today, but the McLaren Racing team is the same team. And they've gone on, I think they've won 10 Constructors' Championships and had a total of 12 Formula One champions. So the McLaren Racing team has been really, really successful, and it all started with Bruce McLaren. And like I say, he was building his own race cars and putting other drivers in them. Denny Hulme, if you remember, I mentioned earlier, Denny Hulme, who was from New Zealand, a couple of years younger than Bruce, was one of the first drivers, if not the first driver, for Bruce McLaren and McLaren Cars, and that would have been in 1965, 66, I'm thinking. So you know, he started to have success early on. So Bruce won the Le Mans Grand Prix, driving a Ford that was built by Carroll Shelby. If you want to find a little bit more out about that, if you go watch that movie, I think it's called Driving Ferrari or something like that. It was a movie came out about 3-4 years ago, and it's about Carroll Shelby's life and the drivers. And so Bruce McLaren was one of the drivers that in that year when the Fords came in 1, 2, 3, he actually won it the year before that, just outright. But I think it was in probably 1968 or 69. Ford came in first, second, and third at the Le Mans 24-hour race, and so he was driving one of those Formula One cars. So it's the way Bruce died is kind of sad, because he was actually testing out one of his new road sports cars that he was getting ready to get ready for a race. And when it was at a track in Sussex in the south of England, and when he was going through some of the metal work on the car, the body piece of it came loose, and the car became totally unstable. If you remember in an earlier segment when I was talking about the Lotus founder, that they was really experimenting a lot with aerodynamics back then. That Colin Chapman, if you remember, developed the ground effects and stuff like that. Well, anyway, because of the aerodynamics of the car, when the sheet metal came loose, the car spun off, went over, spun around, spun about a few times and hit an embankment, and he was killed instantly. And it's really interesting. Bruce McLaren's friend, let me just check his name for you. Bruce McLaren's friend and teammate Tim Meyer, who was killed a few in the middle 60s, in his book, Bruce McLaren wrote, you know, it is better to have tried and been trying and to achieve and died young than not to have achieved anything and died old. So his whole motto was that it's better to go out and really live life and achieve things in life and don't worry about dying. And if you do die young, then it's better to have died young trying to achieve something than living a long life. So it was kind of a prophetic type of thing that he wrote in that book, in his book, because it turned out that he died trying to achieve something at a very young age. So this segment has been brought to you by Give, Send, Go. You know, there's lots of things that you can choose in life, but there's one thing you can't choose, and that is when you have a bad day. Sometimes you just wake up in the morning and you have a horrible day, and you might have a bad car accident, or somebody gets really sick, or just some misfortune strikes you. Now, you don't have a choice on that, but you do have a choice on the crowdfunding entity that you could go to try and raise money to help you make it through those tough times. And that choice is Give, Send, Go. That it's an easy, simple process to get an account set up and to get folks out there and start helping you raise money. Or you could be doing it for a friend or for a family member, but you need an entity which doesn't do any censorship, doesn't care what you think, doesn't care what you believe, doesn't care what your cause is. All causes are important, and so they're not going to censor you like other crowdfunding entities out there. So go to givesendgo.com. That is givesendgo.com. Next time you need crowdfunding. The crowdfunding could be you want to start a business and you want to raise some money. That's a good avenue to do that. There's a lot of folks today that get out there and do crowdfunding and raise their own money through Give, Send, Go. That's givesendgo.com. Welcome back, for Formula One fans. As I said earlier in the podcast, there's no race this weekend, and I think I might be off a little bit on my dates. I don't know if there's a race next weekend or the weekend after, but anyway. So when there's no race, we're doing special features, and this week, as I mentioned earlier, the special feature is on McLaren Cars. Bruce McLaren was our first segment, his history, and so this segment is going to be on the McLaren Car Company. Its successes, mostly successes. It's had I wouldn't say failures, but had lean years. So anyway, this segment of the Formula One News Hour is brought to you by Moms for Liberty. You know, as we mentioned earlier, back in the I'd say 80s and 90s and early 2000s, teachers and school boards were trying to get the parents to get more involved with their kids' education. And over the last 10 years, that has moved away from encouraging parents to come and help educate their kids to actually finding ways to keep them out of the school. And of course, the reason for that is that we're no longer teaching the kids ABC and mathematics and science and geography and history. We're trying to teach them to figure out what sexual gender that they might want to be when they grow up and go off to college or go off into the working world. Or we're trying to get them to think about white kids being born with privilege and automatically racist and things like that. So Moms for Liberty is out there to try and counterbalance this, I would say, what we call offensive of parents' rights. And so Moms for Liberty, that's momsforliberty.com, have about 183 chapters throughout the nation, and their whole goal is to get folks involved in the get them involved in the school board meetings, get them elected to school boards, get them involved get parents involved, so where we can get back to teaching our kids what our kids need to learn, and that is things that are going to be useful to them when they leave school, like mathematics or English or science or other things that they would need for a chosen career, versus some of these social things that they're trying to push off on them. So please go out and join a chapter, or even create a chapter of your own, and get involved, and go to momsforliberty.com. That is momsforliberty.com. Okay, so let's start with McLaren Cars and the history of McLaren Cars, and where it started, where it went, and where it is today. The first thing to know is that McLaren cars, the racing cars, because the racing cars and the production cars are although they're owned by the same group, they're completely separate business units. So it's not like the company that's building the race cars, building the sports cars that you run out and buy. But anyway, so McLaren Cars was founded in 1963 by Bruce McLaren, and is still an ongoing operation today. It is the second oldest racing company out there. The only one older is Ferrari, and Ferrari, of course, started back in the late 40s, I think 48 or 49, right after racing started coming back in after the Second World War. So Ferrari's been around the longest, and then followed by McLaren Cars, and then I guess followed by that would be the Williams teams. So a lot of your teams today are newer, haven't been around as long, but I figured out to be really successful. I mean, when you look at Mercedes as an example, been highly successful here over the last 10 years. So the McLaren car, the first race cars that they built were what was called the Can-Am car, which was a racing series over here in North America and Canada. And so it was, it was very much a quote-unquote sports car design, something in the realm that other guys that it competed with would be Ferrari, Porsche, to a certain extent Jaguar, although Jaguar didn't really build, they built sports cars like the D-Type and the C-Type, but the Can-Am cars were like a sports car design. Think the Le Mans 24-hour race or Sebring 24-hour race, and the type of cars that they race there, and you can get a picture in your mind of the Can-Am car. So they actually had a lot of success in the Can-Am series in the early days. In addition to Bruce McLaren driving, his first teammate in that series was Chris Amon. Chris Amon was a fellow New Zealander from the South Island, and used to race at a little park down there in Fielding, New Zealand, where that was actually some of his first races down there. And if you remember from the first section, that's where the first love of my life came from, was Fielding, New Zealand. So a little bit of history tied in there. So anyway, Chris and Bruce did quite well, won some races, but they really started filling in and really getting the hang of this Can-Am series, and probably became the most successful Can-Am series races with the American driver Dan Gurney and the New Zealand driver Denny Hume. Between them, they won the Can-Am series. So the Can-Am series ended in the late 50s. The Bruce and the team dropped out. Sorry, in the late 60s, not the late 50s. Bruce and his team dropped out, I think, in about 1968, and I think 69 was the last series year of the Can-Am series, and of course Bruce died the year before that. Actually, I'd be wrong again. It would be 1970, I think, was the last Can-Am series race. But anyway, it was around that time frame, and they were very good at it, and they were very successful at it. And so successful was that car, by the way, that they actually sold that car to other racing teams, and that car is what drove the revenue for the Formula One team. Formula One at that time didn't make a lot of money. It was Colin Chapman that had the bright idea of selling the bodywork of the car as a mobile billboard, so that it was, in the beginning, it was a lot of the toss-up between the cigarette companies and the gas companies about who was spending more money on Formula One cars. But in the early days, Formula One was a gentleman's sport, and so these cars didn't really make much money. There wasn't a lot of prize money. I can remember going to the Formula One races when I was a kid, and the stands wouldn't be full. There wouldn't be a whole bunch of people there. You could get in. Back in that time, I'd get in for the equivalent of about $2 to $3 for an entry fee. Which was a lot of money back then, but let's say it's $20, $25 now, so it's not a lot of money. But still, there wasn't a lot of money in Formula One, so cars were always looking, and drivers were always looking for other ways to make a living. And the sports car series, which a lot of people found a lot more interesting at that time, was where they did that. And so Bruce McLaren used the revenue that he was generating from building his early Can-Am cars to generate revenue to work and build on his Formula One car. So the most successful car out of the Can-Am series was the M8D car, and that was the one that they sold a lot of and generated a lot of revenue from. It also should be noted that Bruce McLaren was testing that car at the Greenwood site in the south of England when he was killed. As I mentioned, not yesterday, but as an earlier part of the podcast, that a piece of sheet metal came loose and it became airborne and rolled over and hit an embankment, and sadly he died. But he achieved great things. It would be great if all of us could achieve as much as he managed to achieve. When you think, here it is, in 2022, and we're talking about Bruce McLaren and McLaren Cars, and lots of wealthy people are running out and buying the McLaren sports car that still has his name on it. So he did achieve a lot in a short life. So in 1970, McLaren ventured into the Indy 500. They had an entry in the Indy 500 that year. It did not do great, but the difference between an Indy car and a Formula One car is quite large, and even in engine design and things like that. So they tried using the same Ford engine that they were using in the Formula One car for the Indy car, and it turned out to be a dismal failure. However, they learned a lot over the next couple of years, and studied a guy called Jim Hall. For all of you US-based Formula One fans and racing fans, and specifically Indy fans, Jim Hall out of Midland, Texas, of all places, is quite a famous car designer, builder, a little bit of a driver, but he's more known for building Indy cars than he was for driving them. And of course, the most famous guy he had driving his car was Jackie Stewart, who I can't remember the exact year, but I guess it's middle 70s, maybe 76, 77. Jackie Stewart drove in the Formula One, in the Indy 500 race. When we get to doing the history, we're going to do a history one week, and it's going to be Jackie Stewart, so we'll come up with the answer to that. But McLaren went on to win the Indy 500 with Johnny Rutherford, who is a very famous IndyCar driver, one of three winners. Not one of three winners, but one of the guys that have won the Indy 500 three times, and twice he did that in 74 and 76 in a McLaren. So their foray was quite successful up until 76. After, in the 78, 79, 77, 78, 79 seasons, they didn't do well at all, and so in 79 decided not to enter the IndyCar scene, and would actually wait until, I believe it's 2017, 2018. They started back with an entry into the Indy 500, and now, of course, they have full-time cars in the Indy 500 series rather than just partaking in the Indy 500 itself. So they do have full-time cars in the Indy League, as they call it. So let's talk about the McLaren, the first Formula One car they built. If you looked at that car and you looked at Colin Chapman's Lotus, you'd say, wow, maybe the same guy designed and built that car. And you'd see that in those days in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, because a lot of the designers were moving around. So you'd have a designer from Lotus all of a sudden moving to McLaren, from McLaren to Williams, and things like that. So there was a reason for that. But the M2B, which was the first Formula One car that they built, it wasn't a very successful car, but it did prove to provide, you know, the energy and the impetus and everything to keep going and to work on it and to build a better car. It was powered by a Ford 3-liter naturally aspirated engine, which turned out to be quite a failure. That engine actually was used in the Indy cars, and if you remember, I said that these engines changed from different car designs and for different purposes. And so Ford at that time although they built quite a few engines, they were not really that successful. It wasn't until the Ford Cosworth came out, and the Cosworth was a name for two brothers that formed, not two brothers, but two guys that formed a company called Cosworth. So it took up part of the last name of one and part of the last name of another and came up with Cosworth. And they did design really successful V8 engines with 4 valves per cylinder and a lot of horsepower and very, very reliable. So the Ford Cosworth engine was around for a good 10, 12, 15 years maybe before it became obsolete, but a very, very successful engine in the racing world. One that, in fact, McLaren would go on to use the following year, along with Lotus and the other guys building their own cars, with the exception of, well, no, BRM which is British Motor Holdings, was using the Cosworth engine, along with Jack Brabham. Jack Brabham, the Australian driver, had formed his own racing team, manufacturing team as well back then in the middle 60s. So, you know, a lot of these guys used a lot of similar parts. What drove them differently a lot of times was the chassis. Monocoque type design made out of aluminium? Was it steel? Remember, weight played a huge part in whether or not these cars were successful or not. So as an example, that M2B car, think about this, weighed 1,152 pounds. That is incredibly light, and when you think about that thing doing 160 miles an hour and you're trying to keep it on the track, that in itself was a feat all on its own. So very, very difficult to keep those really light cars grounded on the track as they went around this circuit. So more and more, you know, aerodynamics was coming to play in their mind. A very interesting story about Bruce McLaren. He actually had climbed into his Can-Am car one day to do a test, and they hadn't put the fuel cap on the car back. They hadn't put it on properly. They hadn't closed it. And as he's heading down the track and going around the track, he looks in his mirror and he sees the fuel cap flapping. And he goes, wait a minute, I'm doing 120, 130 miles an hour. Shouldn't the wind along the side of the car be keeping that fuel cap in place? So he started off being really pissed off that somebody had really missed the boat and not delivered and closed that gas flap, to realizing that he just learned something. And when he pulled back into the pits and did some checks, he actually took a pair of metal cutters and cut away some of the metal around the back of the car, because what he realized was that air was getting trapped underneath there and causing the car, one, to lift, but two, not to get through the air as fast as it possibly could. And strange enough, he picked up about 3 to 5 seconds just by simply cutting pieces of the car off with some metal cutters, because he saw that gas flap. So it's really interesting to learn and to figure out. You know, we think today we've got wind tunnels, we've got all of this modern engineering techniques and computers and all this kind of stuff. And these guys were designing and building by noticing little things like a gas flap. Really incredible. It just really points out, the early guys, just how really smart they were, how incredibly smart that they quickly deduced things and quickly made the changes necessary to move on to the next stage of design. So as I mentioned earlier, they moved to the Ford Cosworth engines in 1968, I think it was 69, and started having a lot of success, both in the Can-Am car, which was phased out, of course, a little later, but the Formula One car started coming into its own. And over the next 10, 12 years, they'd have a lot of success, with drivers like, let me take a note to you, So they had drivers like Derek Bell, Dan Gurney, Denny Hume, Jackie Oliver. A lot of people don't remember Jackie Oliver because he died fairly young, but he was very good. He was also good in sports car, Can-Am racing, Le Mans 24-hour racing. Emerson Fittipaldi, everybody remembers that name. He went on to gain his Formula One World Championship. And also become an Indy 500 winner. So he would join the guys like Jim Clark. He didn't win it in the same years. Jim Clark is still the only guy to do that. But now you're starting to see some of the crossover from Formula One to IndyCar, and from IndyCar to Formula One. Mario Andretti is another guy. Unfortunately, Mario never won the Indy 500, but he was a Formula One champion driving for Lotus. But so they had a lot of success with a lot of different drivers. There was, if you ever get to see the movie on James Hunt won his world championship with McLaren. They would win 2 or 3 constructors championships. So during this era, they developed a lot of drivers. A lot of young drivers came along, and sometimes some of them would be entering Formula One for the first time, and they would come on with McLaren. So McLaren back in those days, was really one of the most successful teams, and would go on, like I say, through that time until about '82. When, if you look at Formula One racing, and that goes for any sport really, there's kind of an up and down, it's like on a rough road. They go up and then they go down, and they up and down. And sometimes the up and down can last 2 or 3 years, or sometimes it can last decades. You think of Ferrari with Michael Schumacher, think of Mercedes of late with Lewis Hamilton. Last year Mercedes was really in there for the World Championship. And had won it with Hamilton for 5-6 years before, and this year, they can't win a race to save their life. So it's really interesting how those ebbs and flows of the different designs and things like that come along affect the different racing teams. The other guys that were driving for that McLaren in that era, I couldn't remember them all because there's so many of them. One was the great Niki Lauda, who also won his 3rd world championship with McLaren, and of course I mentioned James Hunt, but Niki Lauda, if you remember, he was the guy that crashed, and actually it's an interesting story because he and James Hunt were in the hunt before he was driving. I think Lauda was driving for Ferrari at the time, and he and James Hunt, who was driving for McLaren, were in the hunt for the World Championship. And Niki Lauda had a horrible accident, and he got burned. If you ever see pictures of him, the left side of his face was burned, his left ear was burned off. Miraculously, talk about tough, the guy was only out 2 races, but in those 2 races, James Hunt won those 2 races. And so they get to the end of the race, the final race, and James Hunt is leading the championship by 3 points over Niki Lauda. And it was in pouring rain. And so Niki Lauda, the last race of the season, he pulled out of the race. If he'd stayed in, if he'd come in any position there in the top 5, he would win it. There was other guys vying for it, but as it turned out, James Hunt would come in 5th in that race and end up winning his one and only Formula One championship. And of course the Constructors' Championship for McLaren. But the other, James Hunt had a tragic life. He was a wild guy. He liked to party, liked to do lots of things. But unfortunately, he died at a very young age. Not in a car wreck or anything, but he just died at 45 from I believe it was a heart attack. That he died from, or cancer. Could have been one of the others. We'll look it up because we're going to do a segment on the history section one of these weeks on James Hunt. So a lot of this stuff, I'm having to remember from the last 50 years, and at 72, nearly 72, I'll be 72 in a month. My memory, the exact dates and times don't always serve me well, but at least they serve me that I knew he was around. So from the years 1983 to 1992, McLaren moved to a Honda engine. This was Honda's first foray into Formula One, and they had a lot of success. Again, they had Alain Prost, the great French driver, and they had Prost, Mansell, Piquet, and Ayrton Senna. I mean, you couldn't hope for a better lineup of drivers during that time than those guys. And so, they had a lot of success during that time. Prost and Piquet didn't get along that well, so they kind of ended up splitting up. But that was, again, another successful 10 years for McLaren. They did an incredible job. And Honda did an incredible job with the engines, so they had really reliable cars. And remember what we've talked about in past podcasts. How much is it the car that's winning the race, and how much is it that the driver has? So back in that time frame, and one of these days I'm going to get guys like Damon Hill and others from that era to come on, Martin Brundle, to come on and talk about how they feel like the car design and reliability started playing in a big part in winning championships and things like that. I'm sure if Michael Schumacher could talk to us, he would tell us that the car that he was driving was a big part of him winning the championships, because the cars were just so reliable. It used to be it was nothing for a car to blow an engine. You very rarely see that in the races today. They have hydraulic problems, or they have gear shift problems, but you don't see an engine blowing up while they're driving down the track. And you don't see that in IndyCar racing anymore either. And you used to see it all the time. You'd be driving down, and then boom, you'd see a big cloud of smoke and steam come pouring out from the engine department as they blew a piston, or a valve went through a piston or something like that and just destroyed the engine. But you don't see that anymore. So in terms of that time in McLaren's life, they were very, very successful, and they had good drivers, good engineers. And again, during this time, the engineers are moving around. The guys that were doing the aerodynamics were actually probably more important at that time than the guys doing the mechanics or the chassis designs. They started moving from aluminium chassis to composite chassis, which made the cars even lighter. And those composite chassis are the same things that they're using in the cars today. Everything's composite materials. So, they think about this. Think about how light aluminium is from steel, and then think about, we need something lighter than aluminium, so we'll go to composite. But that's what they have to do to try and gain the advantage. But the other thing is, though, as you're making this car lighter, one, you've got to keep it, you got to be able to keep it on the track. But more importantly, as you move from high speed, 220 to 220 high speeds today, down to 40, 60 miles an hour for a corner, you've got to be able to have downforces on the car to make sure that those tires grip on the road, because if they don't, they'll, and you'll see them occasionally, they do. They just have to go straight on. They can't get the car to turn. The cars today have what we call oversteer and understeer. Some drivers do better on understeer, so the car's kind of designed that way, and others drive better with oversteer. Max Verstappen is a good example of how drivers on the same team are different. The Red Bull builds their cars with a little oversteer because that's best for Max Verstappen. But his teammate Checo Perez actually drives understeer better. So that's why you've seen the last few weeks Checo Perez starting to back off a little and not getting up there right in the podium finishes, because the more changes they make to the car that causes a little more oversteer, it has an adverse effect on Checo Perez because he likes understeer. So in 1992, Honda dropped out of Formula 1 racing and dropped out supplying McLaren with Formula 1 engines. And that was because of the rise in pricing and things like that in Japan back then. Japan was going through really high inflation back then, which kind of, from a business perspective, just forced them out of the industry. So McLaren first went back and tried a Ford engine and then tried a Peugeot engine. They also experimented with a Renault engine. But in 1993, they would sign a deal with Mercedes that would take them all the way through to 2014 for Mercedes to supply them engines. And they had a lot of success in the beginning, with drivers like Lewis Hamilton and David Coulthard, Kiki Raikkonen, and Fernando Alonso. A little bit of off the just driver history there. Hamilton and Alonso really had a lot of problems working together. I think because Alonso was kind of the number one driver because he's a little older than Hamilton, but Hamilton didn't like being in the number two spot. So anyway, at the end of one of the years they were together, they split up and went their own ways. And then of course, Hamilton went on to Mercedes and had a lot of success. As we know, with Mercedes. But David Coulthard would win his championship, and Kiki Raikkonen would win his championships with McLaren. So all told, I think McLaren would win 12 constructors championships and 7 world champion drivers championships. That might be a little different than what I said yesterday. Remember, I'll do more when it comes to things like this. I do more research. And sometimes I'm just working from my memory from, in this case, 30, 40 years ago, which I'm happy to say is not bad, but it's not perfect. So when you see these little discrepancies in there, and then just know that at the beginning, what I've said in the first part of the segment, that I've double checked it in the second segment. I've got it right. So anyway, as the 90s gave way to the 2000s. Then we saw the domination of Ferrari with Michael Schumacher, and then we saw the domination with Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's interesting how you see these ebbs and flows of domination, because the last 4 or 5 years Ferrari couldn't do anything right. They're having an all right year now. In actual fact, if they could get some of the decision-making processes down, they would probably be leading the Formula 1 championships and not Red Bull. But they started off, really well in the first 4 or 5 races. They got everything right, and Charles Leclerc was leading the championship points by quite a lot. But anyway, so as this domination ebbs and flows comes along, then I'm sure we're going to see McLaren cars come along. And get back into the spotlight. So in 2017, they signed Lando Norris as their driver, who came on and is now their number one driver. And a couple of years ago, they signed Danny Ricciardo, and I think there was a lot of hope that Danny Ricciardo could actually help bring along and mature Lando Norris, but in Lando Norris the last couple of years, and especially this year, has really come into his own, and he's doing really nicely. He's up there in the championship points. You know, his car's not quite what it should be yet. You know, they're trailing a little bit in the Constructor Championship, but I don't think it's that much longer before they'll be up there. Now they've got this this young Australian kid, I think his name Pastore, Omar Pastore. Let me just check my notes. Sorry, it's Oscar Piastri from Australia. He is apparently better than Max Verstappen at the same age, and they're all singing his praises about he's going to be, you know, one of the greatest drivers ever, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see how McLaren does going forward. You know, it's nice to see that you know, a guy woke up one day, had an idea, wanted to be a race car driver, decided to be a race car driver, started building his own race cars. And here we are, you know, 60 years later, we're still watching the results of that brilliant mind play out. So anyway, we're going to end this section with just a little bit explaining the difference between the sports cars and the McLaren Formula One cars. So there's a company called the McLaren Group. And inside that group is a number of companies, and one of them is the McLaren Racing Cars, and one of them is McLaren Cars. So that although they're under the same group, they are completely separate entities. Both cars are built at the same plant in Woking, in England. And another interesting fact: McLaren is building a $50 million site up close to between Sheffield and Rotherham, which is in Yorkshire, England, to focus on building composite chassis for the future. The sports car also uses composite chassis, so you know all the money being spent won't be used just in Formula One or for Indy cars. They're back in Indy car, but also in the street car that you can buy. And you know, they're really cute little cars. Slightly bigger than the Lotus, but and from what I've heard, slightly more reliable. But not to knock Lotus, because I love Lotus. I think they're a great little sports car. But so anyway, when you go down and or you see one of these cars in the street, just remember that what you're looking at is the idea of a man that was born in 1937, and his ideas are still alive today in the McLaren team. This segment of the Formula One News Hour has been brought to you by Thenology. You know, we've talked a lot about the amount of data that these cars generate and the amount of data that businesses generate, both large and small. And with the advent of artificial intelligence and everybody having their own website and wanting to build their own website, then more and more data centers are needed to house all this data. And that is where Thenology comes into play. Thenology is a privately owned data center in Austin, Texas. It has a private cloud, a public cloud, and of course provides disaster recovery services, and also provides co-location for those companies that want to stay on their own servers but need a secure place to keep them, that has stabilized power, is up 24/7, stabilized internet, stabilized cooling. These data centers, you won't believe the amount of heat that computers put out, and that heat has to be cooled, and it's very difficult to get the kind of cooling needed out of your office or somewhere, or your home. So some people work out of their homes. So the best place to keep that is at a data center. Or if you want to host your website or build your website, you want to start a gaming company or host a gaming site, then Thenology is the place to do it. That is Thenology.com. Again, Thenology.com. Thank you, and we'll see you next week. And I haven't decided on the history, but I'm leaning towards Jackie Stewart, or as people know him today, Sir Jackie Stewart. The Formula One News Hour is produced by Andre Kuhn, who also provides all of our technical assistance. So big thank you to Andre Kuhn for all of his hard work this week and all the other weeks. And he'll be here next week producing and providing all the technical assistance we need.